My name is Carol Whitmore. I'm 62 years old, a retired school teacher, a mother of one son, and a widow for the past 15 years. I live alone in the house my late husband built, an old Victorian home filled with memories, quiet mornings, and the kind of peace that only comes after a lifetime of doing things the right way. I've never been one for drama. I always believed that if you treat people with kindness and patience, life usually works itself out. But nothing in my life prepared me for what happened after my son got married. His new wife came into our lives smiling, polite, and well-dressed. But behind that charm was something cold, something calculating. And when she tried to steal the very home I had spent my entire life protecting, I had to make a choice. I could let her take everything I had left, or I could fight back, quietly, carefully, and in a way she'd never expect. And trust me, she never saw it coming. I still remember the way my heart swelled with mixed emotions on the day my son, Daniel, got married. It was supposed to be one of the happiest days of my life, seeing my only child walk down the aisle, starting a new chapter with the woman he loved. But something in me, deep in my gut, whispered that I needed to stay quiet, to hold on to a truth I hadn't shared with anyone. That day, dressed in a soft blue dress that reminded me of the one I wore on my own wedding day, I sat in the front row of the small, elegant garden ceremony, smiling as best I could, while a storm of memories and doubts stirred inside me. Daniel had always been a kind, hardworking boy. Smart, too. But when he met Melissa, everything changed so quickly that I could barely keep up. They'd only been dating for 8 months before he proposed, and though she seemed polite on the surface, there was something about the way she looked at me, or maybe the way she avoided looking at me, that made me feel like a guest in my own family. She was beautiful, no doubt, tall, blonde, with that polished, perfect style that always felt just a little too controlled. But it wasn't her looks that worried me. It was the way she spoke about the future, their future, the way she mentioned smart financial moves and planning for long-term security, as if love were a business deal and my son a stepping stone. When my husband Peter passed away 5 years ago, he left me the old family estate he had inherited from his parents. It was a sprawling Victorian home with 12 rooms, a huge backyard garden, and the kind of craftsmanship you just don't see anymore. It had been appraised at over $7 million, mostly because of the land it sat on. But to me, it wasn't just property. It was home. Peter and I had raised Daniel there. We built our life within those walls. And when Peter died, I promised myself I would protect that house for as long as I lived, and that I would only tell Daniel about the full extent of its value when I felt he was ready. But I never expected I'd have to keep that promise from my own son. When he announced the engagement, that whisper inside me turned into a quiet scream. Something told me Melissa wasn't just marrying Daniel, she was marrying into something she suspected existed, and she intended to get her hands on it. I had no hard proof, just a feeling. But over the years, I've learned that a woman my age doesn't need evidence to recognize ambition wrapped in silk. So I made a decision that day, before the wedding. I would not tell them about the estate's true value. And I certainly wouldn't mention the trust Peter had set up before he died, an account tied to the house, filled with investments and insurance payouts, meant for emergencies, retirement, or, God forbid, legal protection. I stayed silent, and I smiled. I watched them say their vows. I toasted their future with a shaky glass of champagne, and I pretended to be the proud, excited mother. But inside, I had already started planning for a storm I feared was coming. I told myself it was better this way, better to wait and see, better to stay quiet and observant until I knew for sure who Melissa really was. Because once you sign over a piece of your soul, you don't get it back. And that house was my soul. What I didn't know then was that just 72 hours later, my new daughter-in-law would show up at my door with a notary, a smug smile, and a stack of papers that she hoped I wouldn't bother to read. The morning after the wedding, I stood by the kitchen window, sipping my coffee the way I always do. Black, no sugar, just like Peter used to take it. And I looked out over the garden where we had hosted the small reception just 2 days earlier. The folding chairs were still stacked by the fence, flower petals scattered along the grass, like some memory refusing to be cleaned up. And in that quiet moment, I told myself I was just being paranoid, that every new marriage comes with growing pains, and that Melissa would eventually settle in and maybe even surprise me. But deep down, I already knew. I knew that the way she'd been looking at me during the reception wasn't curiosity or nervousness. It was calculation. Daniel had told me they'd be stopping by in the afternoon to pick up a few things he left in the garage. Old sports trophies, photo albums, boxes filled with childhood keepsakes. And when they pulled up in their new black SUV, I felt that same twist in my stomach I hadn't been able to shake since the day he introduced me to her. Melissa came in first, all polished and bright, wearing heels much too high for walking through grass, and holding a sleek leather folder clutched tightly in her arms. Daniel trailed behind, still glowing from the honeymoon glow that hadn't even begun yet. And when I asked if they'd like tea or lemonade, he smiled and said, "Sure, Mom," while Melissa politely declined and said, "Actually, I was hoping to chat with you privately, just for a moment." That was the first time I felt it directly. The shift. It wasn't just a new daughter-in-law wanting to bond with her husband's mother. It was a woman on a mission, and I could see it in the way she stood too straight, in the way her tone was too sweet, too measured, like she had rehearsed every word before even ringing the doorbell. She sat down across from me in the sunroom, unfolded her folder on the table, and said something I'll never forget. "I know this might feel a little early, but Daniel and I are very future-minded, and we just want to make sure everything in the family is protected and transparent." I raised an eyebrow, trying not to show my confusion or my suspicion, and simply said, "Go on?" She smiled, like a cat who thinks it's already won, and began laying out a series of documents that, according to her, were standard intergenerational planning tools. She said things like, "This way, everyone's on the same page," and "It'll save so much hassle later down the line," and "We just want to help you manage your legacy while you still have full control of it." That phrase, "while you still have full control of it," sent a chill straight through my spine. I didn't touch the papers. I didn't even pretend to read them. I just looked at her and asked calmly, "Did Daniel ask you to put this together?" And that's when her smile faltered. Just for a second, not enough for most people to notice, but enough for a mother to see the crack in the performance. She said, "Well, he trusts me with these things," which wasn't an answer. It was a red flag, waving itself like a warning I could no longer ignore. When Daniel came back into the room with a dusty box in his arms, I smiled and told Melissa I'd look over the paperwork later. She thanked me sweetly and gave me a kiss on the cheek before leaving, but I noticed how she didn't take the folder with her. She wanted me to read it, expected me to sign it, and something told me that whatever was in those papers, it had nothing to do with protecting me and everything to do with transferring power. Later that night, once the house was quiet again and I was alone with a cup of chamomile tea and the soft ticking of the grandfather clock Peter restored by hand, I finally opened the folder. And what I saw made my blood run cold. I must have stared at those documents for over an hour that night. Sitting under the soft yellow light of the lamp Peter installed himself in our reading room nearly 20 years ago. The same room where we used to dream about retirement, travel, and spoiling future grandkids. But what lay in front of me on the table wasn't part of any dream. It was a carefully written plan to take something from me while making it look like I had willingly handed it over. The folder Melissa left behind contained what she called a family consolidation agreement, but in plain English, it was a legal trap. Buried under polite language and confusing clauses, the papers proposed that I transfer managing ownership of the house to Daniel, with Melissa listed as his financial partner, giving her the right to make decisions about the estate, including selling, renting, refinancing, or using it as loan collateral. It was dressed up to look like protection for me, like a kindness, but it was a slow, smiling theft, cloaked in legalese and fake concern. They probably thought I'd be too sentimental, too tired, or too trusting to read past the first page, but I read every word. Twice. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, just as I was deciding whether to call my lawyer or my sister first, the doorbell rang. It was still early, barely past 9, and I hadn't even gotten out of my robe yet. Through the front window, I saw a black sedan parked in the driveway, and standing beside it was Melissa again, perfectly dressed in beige slacks and a pale pink blouse, holding her phone in one hand and waving casually with the other. But this time, she wasn't alone. Behind her stood a man in a charcoal gray suit, holding a leather briefcase and a clipboard. I opened the door with a tight smile, trying not to let my heart pound its way into my voice, and Melissa beamed at me like nothing was out of the ordinary. "Good morning, Carol," she chirped, stepping past the threshold before I could invite her in. "This is Mr. Bennett. He's a notary we've worked with before. Just here to help with a few signatures so we can take the next step in our little plan from yesterday." I just stared at her, not even bothering to fake confusion this time. My voice was calm, too calm, as I said, "Melissa, I told you I needed time to read those papers. This is not something you just drop on someone overnight." But she kept smiling, that same polite, polished smile that didn't reach her eyes, and replied, "Of course I understand. It's just that the longer we wait, the more complicated things can get later, especially for Daniel. I'm just trying to help keep everything smooth." She made it sound like she was doing me a favor. Like bringing a notary into my home uninvited was a thoughtful gesture. Mr. Bennett, he barely said a word, just nodded and opened his briefcase, pulling out the very same papers I had already read, now neatly prepared for signing. He placed them on the coffee table, like it was just a delivery, like this was all normal, like I was just another old woman ready to hand off her life's worth in exchange for peace. I looked at Melissa then, not at her outfit, not at her carefully curled hair, not at her phony warmth, but into her, and I saw it clearly. This wasn't about love or family or unity. This was about control, about getting the house, about stripping away everything I had quietly built and protected, all while smiling sweetly and calling me Mom. So I leaned forward, folded my hands over the top page, and said slowly and clearly, "Thank you both for coming by, but I won't be signing anything today, or ever. And next time, Melissa, call first. I don't respond well to surprises." Her smile cracked, just a flicker, but it was enough to show me she wasn't used to being told no. Mr. Bennett cleared his throat awkwardly, packed up the papers, and followed her back out to the car without another word. And as I watched them drive away from the front porch, barefoot and in my robe, I knew two things with absolute certainty. First, that Melissa had underestimated me, and second, that this was far from over. After they left that morning, the silence in the house felt heavier than usual. Not peaceful, not comforting, just heavy, like the walls themselves were holding their breath with me. I sat at the kitchen table for what felt like an hour without moving, the untouched tea on the counter slowly going cold, while my mind ran through every detail of the last 24 hours. I kept asking myself whether Daniel had known what she was planning, whether he had seen those papers, whether his name was just printed on them, or if he had read every word and still let her bring them to my door. I didn't want to believe it. I didn't want to believe my own son would stand by while someone tried to cut me out of my own life. But the part that hurt more than anything was how little he seemed to be involved at all, as if she were already making the decisions for both of them, as if he had simply handed her the pen and stepped out of the room. By the next morning, I couldn't take the uncertainty any longer. I called a lawyer I hadn't spoken to in years, a man Peter and I had used back when we were finalizing our wills and building a trust for Daniel's future. He was semi-retired now, working only part-time from home. But when I explained what had happened, he told me to bring the documents right away. I printed every page Melissa had left behind, slid them into a plain envelope, and drove out to the quiet little office where I had once signed paperwork that gave Peter power of attorney during my surgery. Now I was here again, decades older, hoping someone could protect me from a different kind of threat. He read the papers slowly, pausing often, and scribbled notes in the margins as he went. I watched his brow crease deeper with each page. After about 20 minutes, he looked up, and even before he said anything, I knew I had been right to worry. He explained that what Melissa had put together wasn't just a casual agreement or a family plan, like she'd called it. It was a disguised transfer of control, one that would legally bind me to decisions made without my consent. If I had signed those papers, she would have gained not just influence, but ownership, and undoing it later would have been a nightmare. But then came the worst part. He told me something I hadn't expected, something that hadn't even occurred to me. Apparently, Melissa had already begun filing certain pre-approval forms with the county office, forms that usually precede property refinancing or reassignment. My name was still on everything, yes, but my address had been flagged in a pending application with her name listed as a financial partner and Daniel's as a primary contact. It wasn't just a plan anymore. It was already in motion. That's when the ground beneath me shifted, not literally, but in that way your world feels when something you thought was stable begins to crack. She hadn't just tried to trick me once. She was building a system around me, step by step, so that even if I said no, even if I never signed a thing, the foundation would be weakened, slowly eroded until I wouldn't even recognize the house I had fought so hard to keep. As I drove home, every tree I passed, every house on the street looked different, like I was seeing the world from the inside of a snow globe someone had just shaken up. And when I pulled into my driveway, I didn't go inside right away. I stood in front of the porch, staring at the house Peter had poured his heart into, the one where Daniel had taken his first steps, where we had celebrated birthdays and mourned losses and held each other through storms. And now, somehow, a woman who hadn't even been in our lives a year was trying to make it hers. But I wasn't scared anymore. I was angry. And I knew that if Melissa was going to turn this into a game of strategy, then I had no choice but to play smarter, colder, and much more quietly than she expected. Because this wasn't just a house. This was my legacy. By the next morning, I had already made up my mind. There would be no more waiting, no more second guessing, no more hoping things might settle on their own. Melissa had made her move, and now it was my turn. I went straight to the bank, dressed in the same deep green coat Peter had once said made me look like a woman who runs the whole damn town, and I reopened the trust account we had created years ago, the one meant to protect the estate in emergencies, the one we hadn't touched since his passing. The banker, a soft-spoken man about my son's age, looked a bit surprised when he pulled up the file, noting the size of the investments and assets, but I kept my expression still, like this was just another Tuesday. With a few signatures and a quiet request for everything to be placed into an updated irrevocable trust, I moved the house, the land, and every remaining asset tied to it out of my personal name and into a legal shell that only I had the key to. It was quiet, clean, and invisible to anyone not looking for it. Exactly the kind of move Melissa wouldn't anticipate from a woman who made banana bread from scratch and still mailed holiday cards in cursive. It felt good to be decisive, powerful even. But that feeling didn't last long, because just as I was getting back to the house, pulling slowly into the driveway with a bag of groceries in the passenger seat, I saw Daniel's car parked out front, and for a brief moment my heart dropped straight through my chest. He hadn't called, hadn't texted, hadn't said a word since the visit with the notary. Something about the way his car was slightly crooked, like he'd pulled in too fast, made me instantly tense. I parked behind him, hands tightening on the wheel for a second longer than I meant to, and stepped out, hoping for a simple conversation, but preparing for the worst. He was already inside when I walked through the door, sitting in the living room, elbows on his knees, staring at the fireplace like he didn't recognize it. I braced myself for anger, for accusations, for some kind of speech about how Melissa was just trying to help. But instead, he looked up at me with an expression I hadn't seen on his face since he was a teenager. Nervous, unsure, almost ashamed. For a moment, I thought maybe this would be the part where he apologized, where he admitted he didn't know what Melissa had planned, where he would take my side and everything would settle. But instead, he asked a question I wasn't prepared for. He asked if I had signed the papers. And when I told him no, his whole posture shifted, shoulders tightening just enough for me to see that he hadn't come to support me. He had come to pressure me. I felt a heat rise up in my chest that I hadn't felt in years. Not sadness, not fear, but something close to betrayal, sharp and bitter. And for a brief, terrifying moment, I nearly lost my composure. I wanted to yell, to ask him how he could sit there in the house his father built and watch someone try to take it apart, how he could not see what she was doing. My voice was almost at the edge of cracking, my hand clutching the grocery bag so tight the paper started to crumple, and I could feel the tears beginning to build right behind my eyes. Tears not of weakness, but of sheer, overwhelming fury. It was the kind of moment where just one wrong word could have torn everything apart. But instead of yelling, instead of accusing, I did something else. I set the groceries down, walked over to the armchair across from him, and sat slowly, keeping my voice steady, my tone calm, my breathing even. I told him I had read the documents carefully, that I had spoken to a lawyer, and that the plan Melissa had presented wasn't just inappropriate, it was dangerous. I told him I had taken steps to protect the estate, not from him, but from any outside influence, and that, if he ever wanted to understand exactly what I had done, I would be happy to explain it, just not with Melissa in the room. For a second, he didn't respond. He just looked at me, blinking slowly, like he was trying to figure out if I had somehow changed when he wasn't looking. And then something shifted in his face. Not a smile, not regret, but maybe a flicker of doubt in what he thought he knew. He didn't stay long after that. He said he had to get back, that Melissa was waiting. But when he stood up to leave, he paused for a moment at the front door, hand on the knob, not turning it, just holding it, like maybe he wanted to ask something else, but didn't know how. And then he left, quietly, no slamming, no shouting, just the door closing gently behind him. And when the silence returned, I finally exhaled. The storm hadn't passed, but I had made my move. And no matter what came next, I knew I was no longer playing defense. The days that followed were quiet, but not peaceful, the kind of quiet that hums with tension, like a wire stretched too tight. Daniel didn't call. Melissa didn't show up again, but that didn't fool me for a second. Silence, in their case, wasn't surrender. It was calculation. I knew Melissa wasn't the type to let go that easily, especially not after being outmaneuvered so early in her game, and sure enough, the signs began to appear. Not loudly, but in subtle, insidious ways that made me feel like I was being circled by something clever and patient. First, there was the phone call from the city's tax office, just a routine verification regarding the property's valuation. Then came the letter in the mail addressed to the Daniel Whitmore family, asking about eligibility for historical property credits. A week later, the local paper published an article about neighborhood redevelopment grants, and somehow my house had been listed as a candidate for modern subdivision consideration. That wasn't coincidence. It was pressure, slow, bureaucratic pressure. Melissa's new strategy. She was no longer trying to take the house with forged smiles and ready-made documents. Now, she was trying to isolate me, confuse me, wear me down by creating doubt and red tape and uncertainty about what I really owned. It was a psychological siege, a long game. And in the middle of it all, Daniel stayed silent, like a man who had decided his comfort was more important than his conscience. One afternoon, I saw Melissa's car parked down the street, engine off, windows tinted. She sat there for over an hour, never approaching the door, never making herself visible, just waiting, watching. She wanted me to know she was still there, that she wasn't finished. That night, I opened the safe where I kept every deed, every will, every copy of the trust agreements, documents Peter and I had gathered through decades of careful planning. I checked each one, then checked them again, and it wasn't until I reached the bottom of the stack that I found something that didn't belong. A single sheet of paper, folded clean, slipped in with our family trust file. It was a draft, not signed, not filed, but dated and formatted, of a power of attorney giving Daniel full control over the estate in the event of cognitive decline. A clause Melissa must have slipped in during one of her visits. A draft she clearly intended to push through later, perhaps with pressure, confusion, or a staged medical visit. My hands were shaking, not with fear, but with something worse, rage, sharp and cold. And that's when I made my next move. I called my lawyer again, but not just to reinforce the trust. This time, I asked him to help me make something invisible. I asked him to help me draft a temporary title transfer into the name of someone else I trusted more than anyone in this world. 2 weeks later, Melissa called me herself. For the first time since the notary incident, her voice was cheerful but rehearsed, the kind of tone that people use when they're laying down bait. She suggested a family dinner, something casual, just the three of us, and I agreed, even though I knew it wasn't about family or peace. It was a stage, a performance. She wanted to play kind in front of Daniel and corner me again. Only this time, she thought I had fewer options. I arrived at their house with a pie, just like I used to bring when Daniel was in college, apple, with the cinnamon folded deep into the crust. Melissa smiled when she opened the door, but her eyes were cold. Daniel seemed distracted, nervous almost, but I could see how much he wanted this dinner to be normal. He still didn't know which side he was on. The meal passed with small talk. Nothing meaningful, just careful words and half smiles. And then, over dessert, Melissa stood, pulled a thin folder from the kitchen counter, and placed it gently on the table in front of Daniel. She explained that it was time to revisit things and that it would just be easier on everyone if the future was legally stable. I didn't touch my fork. I didn't speak. I just watched her set her trap. Daniel looked at me, not at her, but at me, and asked if this was the same paperwork I had rejected. I told him it wasn't exactly the same, but it had the same heart. He didn't say anything. He opened the folder. He started reading, and then Melissa made her mistake. She turned to me with that quiet triumph on her face and explained casually that since I had refused to collaborate, they had sought a second legal opinion. A lawyer she knew had helped Daniel draft an emergency clause that would allow him to assume responsibility for me should my mental capacity decline. That phrase again. So calm, so calculated. She said they had submitted a request for medical assessment just to cover all bases. She said it as if she were talking about a flu shot. I didn't speak for a moment. I simply stared down at the folder, and when I finally looked up, I thanked them for their honesty. I stood, slowly, took my bag, and said I needed to go. Daniel didn't follow me, not right away, because to them, in that moment, it looked like they had won. And for 3 days, I let them believe it. I didn't answer my phone. I didn't respond to messages. I didn't leave the house. I sat in my garden, trimming the rose bushes Peter had planted with his own hands, and waited for the final piece of my plan to settle into place. Because, while they were celebrating their little victory, something else had quietly changed behind the scenes. The house, the land, everything tied to the family estate was no longer in my name. It was now owned, fully and legally, by my granddaughter, a quiet, strong-willed 26-year-old woman, Daniel's daughter from his first marriage, who Melissa had dismissed from the very beginning as irrelevant. She lived 3 states away, worked in non-profit legal aid, and had the same fire in her that Peter used to have in his eyes when someone tried to push him around. I had transferred it all into her name, temporarily, yes, but protected under a trust with terms that only I and my lawyer understood. Melissa couldn't touch it. Daniel had no authority. And when the legal letter arrived at their doorstep, delivered by courier, stamped with formal language and finality, they realized they hadn't won anything. They had triggered the final clause of the trust. An act of coercion or manipulation by any family member would lock the estate for 10 years, with ownership and rights passing directly to the next generation. The house was gone from their reach permanently, and justice had been served, not with a fight, but with precision, timing, and the strength that only a mother protecting her home could truly wield. The week after the letter was delivered, the silence from Daniel and Melissa was louder than any shouting match ever could have been. No calls, no emails, no more papers slid across my table. Just silence, a heavy, embarrassed, stunned silence, and it was exactly what I had waited for. I didn't celebrate out loud. I didn't pour champagne or gloat in front of anyone. I simply made myself a cup of chamomile tea, the way I always had, and sat by the kitchen window as the late afternoon light spilled across the garden, golden and quiet. That light had a different kind of warmth that day, not the warmth of summer, but the kind that comes from within, when you know you've done something difficult, and you've done it right. The estate was safe. The house was now officially owned by my granddaughter, who had called me in tears when the paperwork was finalized, not because of the gift itself, but because, as she said, she could finally see what kind of woman her grandmother really was. She promised to never live there unless I asked her to, never sell, never touch a brick without my blessing. And I believed her because, unlike Melissa, she hadn't earned it through manipulation. She had earned it through love, trust, and patience. Daniel eventually showed up, alone. No Melissa. He knocked on the back door instead of the front, just like he used to when he was a teenager sneaking back in after curfew. He looked thinner, tired, but not angry. He didn't say much at first. He just sat across from me at the kitchen table, where so many things had started and ended in our family, and stared at the grooves in the wood from where Peter used to tap his pen while reading the morning paper. Then, in a quiet voice, he asked why I hadn't told him sooner, why I had let things go this far. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't scold him. I told him that when a mother sees her child walking into a fire, she can either scream or she can prepare a path through the flames. I had tried the first. This was the second. He nodded slowly, said nothing else. And when he left that day, I didn't know if I would hear from him again. But weeks passed. Then a letter came, handwritten, from Daniel. He told me Melissa had left, that after the trust was locked and her access to anything related to the estate vanished, she changed. She accused him of weakness. She called me manipulative. She blamed everyone but herself. And then she was gone. No goodbye. Just her designer shoes missing from the closet and a bitter little note folded into the kitchen counter. Enjoy your mother. I hope she was worth it. She had lost, not loudly, not with flames, but with silence, the kind that follows a well-played checkmate. In the months that followed, the house settled back into itself. The roses bloomed deeper. The creaks in the hallway returned to their soft rhythm. My granddaughter visited more often, sometimes bringing fresh tomatoes from her garden, sometimes just bringing her company. And I slept better, not because I had won, but because I had protected what mattered. There's a kind of justice that doesn't come from courts or lawyers. It comes from waiting, from knowing who you are and what you've built, and refusing to let it be taken from you by anyone, no matter how pretty their smile or how clever their plan. I had been underestimated, but that was their mistake, because this house was never just a house. It was a legacy, and I made sure it would stay that way long after I'm gone.